Hi, folks. Welcome to Inside the Marble Palace, the podcast for Post Media Saskatchewan on the legislature. I am Murray Mandryk, legislative columnist for the Regina Leader Post, and joining me today, as usual, Arthur White-Crummey, legislative reporter for the Leader Post. Almost gave you promotion there, or a demotion, actually.
I think it's more of a demotion.
Demotion, a curse. And Lynn Giesbrecht, a reporter from the Leader Post who busies her time these days covering COVID, which she did this week. Hi, Lynn. How you doing?
Good.
Tell us about the press conference this week. What you saw is the newer developments from Premier Scott Moe and Chief Medical Officer Saqib Shahab, and where we might be going from here. What's the latest news?
Yeah, so I think variants continue to be the big news, but we had 14 new cases of P1 that were detected. And so I think that's something that was definitely top of mind at the press conference, was just that that's one of those new variants. We hadn't had a lot of cases. It's got some concerns about being even more transmissible than the other variants, maybe more deadly, but that's still being looked into potentially. So yeah, definitely cause for concern there. And just kind of seeing a bit more of a walk back from Premier Scott Moe on becoming serious about COVID again. It seemed like sometimes there's been talk about reopening potentially and all that kind of stuff, but coming back as a hard line like, hey, we really need to clamp down on COVID still. We need to make sure that we're all doing our part to fight against that, even though no new measures were coming out. So that was interesting, but still tapping that personal responsibility line and asking people to really take care of what they're doing and prevent COVID from spreading further.
The language was different, wasn't it, this week compared with what we've heard in previous weeks, where he seemed a little bit more optimistic about the notion that maybe sometime in May or whenever we could see more reopenings. There doesn't seem to be much hope for that right now. And I thought he had a pretty direct message to younger people, which I thought was a little different. Now, I know this is related directly to the vaccine rollout, but I think, as you mentioned, it's related to the new variants. Can you explain maybe what he was messaging and why he was messaging that, Lynn?
Yeah, so throughout the pandemic, as vaccines started coming out, we've seen Moe be like, hey, vaccines are our way through this. And yesterday, he still said that, but he also changed it a little bit. And he said, okay, we're seeing variants now, and it's hitting people who are younger, 30s, 40s, even their 20s, and they're ending up in hospital. And now he's like, okay, if you're under 40, so you're not eligible for a vaccine right now, take care. Don't watch your gatherings, don't gather, right? He's specifically addressing young people and saying, don't take this lightly. At the beginning of the pandemic, we were hearing COVID isn't hitting young people as seriously as it is hitting the elderly people. And now we're really seeing that shift, and we're seeing the young people hit harder, A, because they're not vaccinated, but also B, because the variants are just tougher against them, it seems. So yeah, just really strong messaging that young people now really, really need to be careful.
And Arthur, I think the messaging is getting a little different in the legislature too, both from the opposition and from the government. We'll get into the opposition messaging and how they're seemingly taking a different approach. But let's talk about what the government is telling people, particularly those who are gathering for events related to anti-masks, anti-lockdown stuff. I thought they were considerably tougher in their language from both Premier Moe and Health Minister Paul Merriman this week. Why would that be, and explain why people might see that to be the case?
Well, I mean, I think that there's growing frustration towards some of these movements, particularly as they start gathering outside of vaccine clinics, outside of hospitals. It almost seems as though their approach has become more radical and more extreme. So I think to some extent, the politicians in both parties are just tapping into widespread public fatigue and anger towards some of these groups, which I don't think represent any sizable segment of the population. So that's part of it, but I'm not sure that I feel that the government messaging has been entirely different. I mean, we heard Scott Moe adopt pretty much the same line, that these gatherings, that these protests are unacceptable primarily because they're encouraging other people to violate public health orders. And I think he expressed particular shock as many of us did, that they gathered outside of the Regina General Hospital in the midst of significant pressures on ICUs when families are, visiting people that may be dying or may be gravely ill. They have to then exit the hospital and see a group of people denying the very illness that their loved ones are dying of or suffering from. So that's just obvious that it's good politics and just good morality to call those people out. That being said, I think we continue to see Ryan Miley being a little bit more forceful on that. I'm not.
Let's talk about that for a second, because I think that's if the NDP messaging, the opposition messaging hasn't changed, and I don't think, similar to your observation about government, really isn't altering that much, but I think it is getting more strident, especially coming from Ryan Miley. Is that because he's coming more from the perspective of an frustrated opposition leader not getting anywhere, or is it because he's coming from the perspective of a doctor that's kind of been through the ICUs and is encouraging the Premier and the Health Minister to do so because he is basically arguing they're not getting it, they're not getting the point. I really don't know if going through the ICUs is going to change public policy all that much, and that too makes good politics. But tell us a little bit about why and what Ryan Miley is saying that leaves the suggestion the NDP are being a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more strident in their criticism of government.
Yeah, Ryan Miley has seemed genuinely frustrated and genuinely passionate about the pressures, particularly on Saskatchewan's ICUs in recent weeks. And that makes sense because he's a doctor. He has very good connections with the medical community. And I think that's particularly shown itself in recent exchanges that we've seen over the Premier's reluctance to visit ICUs after an NDP invitation to do so. And I think that's really where the NDP has found some legs, has found the right song sheet to sing from, and has really given them a good run in recent question periods, asking the Premier why he refuses or is hesitant to make that visit. At first, the Premier was saying that it was because it would be inappropriate to visit ICUs, just because the NDP was inviting him to do so for what he thought were political reasons. But then when that was denied by doctors within the ICUs, he said that really it was because he was getting properly briefed by his health officials, by the CEO of the SHA. So I really think that the NDP has been successful on that line of questioning because they really made a transition from criticizing the government in fairly general terms, asking the Premier and the Health Minister, whether they regret anything that they've done, just talking about the severity of the third wave, to really getting into more laser-focused lines of attack that force the Premier to answer specific questions and that kind of back him into a corner, which is, I think, what we saw with this ICU invitation, which is why the NDP has used it one day after another over the past 2 weeks.
It is effective. But I also think it draws attention to the fault lines that are existing in this province, and there are several. And I'll go back to you, Lynn, in terms of both what you saw coming out of the press conferences, where that seems evident in terms of sincere disagreement among people, not just in terms of people that are opposed to lockdowns or are anti-mask, but in terms of health professionals. One of the emerging themes that I think we're seeing right now, and I'm very curious about, is that a year into this pandemic, I can't answer people's question as to what measures, what metrics, what benchmarks the government truly uses to basically make its decisions to either further lock down things or in the future, I presume, to open things up. Now, the Premier and Dr. Shahab were asked that very directly on Tuesday, but I don't know if the answers were really substantive. Can you go over what they had to say, Lynn, and and why that might be a cause of frustration for people?
Yeah, quite frankly, I don't know if there's a lot to say because there wasn't much answer given. Yeah, they were asked a couple of times, like, okay, what are, like, at the beginning or earlier in the pandemic, we kind of had benchmarks for, like, okay, if we get below 100 cases a day or whatever, then we can start to see this happen or this happen. And that's just not been the case recently. We just don't have that happening. So they were asked with Saskatoon's situation, as Dr. Shahab said, Saskatoon's kind of on red alert with variants spreading there. And so people were asking Kate, like, well, when are we going to get restrictions in Saskatoon? What point do they have to hit? What numbers are you looking for? And the premier was just answering in very broad terms that they're watching it, they're considering restrictions if things worsen, but we weren't given numbers. That just hasn't happened. And same with reopening, like at what point do we need to get below? What are you watching? And he said in very general terms, they're watching, you know, hospitalization numbers and case numbers and test positivity rates, a number of factors there for potential reopening and what would need to change. But again, no specific numbers of what things would need to fall below, which I think is frustrating for some people. People like having goals they can work toward. And right now it just feels like that goal is ever changing, but never fully defined either.
That's such a great point, because I think that is the frustration, and might be the only one that is really shared by both people who are completely anti-shutdown, anti-mask, and even the health professionals that are basically saying, in broad terms, broad strokes at least, the very same thing. Where do we have to be? What are the benchmarks? What are the metrics that will make these determinations related to that? What have you been hearing from both sides related to that, if anything, that you can? And I get it's rather nebulous because people not understanding the benchmarks suggest, but is it as clear to you as it seems to be to me when I talk to people that is the frustration, and people just simply don't know, Lynn, as to what it is that they're supposed to do or where we're supposed to go, what goals we're supposed to achieve if things are to change?
Yeah, I don't know if it's the benchmarks necessarily that are uniting everyone in frustration, but I think we can all agree that frustration is the uniting factor no matter where people stand right now. So, yeah, like you've got the anti-mask, anti-vax crowd that's doing all these protests, and they're getting ever more bold, it seems. And I think for them, they're just like, hey, we want this to end. Let's end it by doing this. And then you've got everyone else following public health orders to the best of their ability, but also becoming increasingly angry with protesters, saying, we also want this to end. And the way to do that is get your vaccine and follow public health orders. But the gap between those two groups has just grown wider and wider and wider, I think, as people become more and more frustrated and more tired of the pandemic.
Arthur, I think the one person that probably wants to see this all end more so than anybody else right now is Premier Scott Moe, if not maybe Paul Merriman, because I think they're just absolutely frustrated and tired of us.
They don't seem to be having a fun time, Murray.
They don't. There has been a distinct effort by the government of late to change the channel, and they do have some good news in that regard in terms of channel changers, things that should be more positives for the government that aren't COVID, because COVID is generally associated with a negative, notwithstanding the hope that the vaccines and variants will change, and we'll ask Lynn about how that might change as we end off. But in terms of the other things that they're talking about this week, there was some good economic news that the government really wants us to focus on this week, related to canola crushing plants, related to helium plants. Talk to us a little bit about the good news that the government is trying to sell, maybe as a bit of a channel changer to get people thinking about something other than COVID-19.
I mean, it is a channel changer, but it's also good news. We actually had a massive pile of investment in the Regina area over the past 2 weeks. We had a $350 million canola crusher from Cargill announced. We had a even larger, though still somewhat undefined, project from Vitera, which is going on that plot of land that you and I reported on, Murray, about the secret buyer. We now know that it's Vitera, and they are spending hundreds of millions of dollars to build the world's largest canola crusher, which is a little notch in the belt for Regina, coming in the next few years. And the government was very quick to seize on that in response to the daily NDP attacks on job numbers, saying, hey, we're finally seeing some major investment in the Regina area, and it's because of what we, as the Sask Party, have been doing. It fits very nicely into their messaging about attracting investment in the agri-food industry. They were able to say that it was largely or partly because of some tax credits that they put into place in past budgets. A lot of the companies confirmed that that was indeed the case. And it fits right into their growth plan targets of attracting more agricultural value-added industries to add value to our raw commodity exports. So this is something that the government was very happy to talk about during question period over the past few days.
And of course, it's not just agriculture. Agriculture is always going to be the fundamental foundation of our economy, notwithstanding the contributions of mining and oil and everything else that we do in this. As agriculture goes, so goes Saskatchewan. But there are always other industries like oil and maybe a few others. Certainly uranium and potash mining that's huge in this province. But now we see another one developing in the form of helium. Tell us about the helium developments and the attack on the periodic table, because this turned into a bit of a humorous debate.
I'm going to confess to you, Murray, that I know very little about helium, aside from the fact that it's a noble gas. And must be respected as a result. But I don't know anything about its industrial applications besides filling up balloons. But that's not really important, because we're going to focus on the political dynamic of what ensued in the legislature when Alina Young made a joke, as she often does, at the expense of Jeremy Harrison, the Trade and Export Development Minister, saying that his boasting about the helium jobs was full of hot air.
And it's not hot air. Can we be clear about that?
We can establish that, I think, despite our lack of knowledge about this. And this left Mr. Harrison somewhat offended on behalf of the helium industry, stating that she should apologize for the insult against him, but towards the North American Helium Company. Now I took because he said North American Helium, that she had offended North American Helium, I was under the impression that he literally meant the gas itself, like the element that is located in North America, that it was offensive to the element. That was possibly somewhat unfair, because it's actually fairly clear to me now that he was referring to the industry. But because it sounded as though he may be referring to the element, Alina Young took him up on his demand.
In fairness, I think Jeremy Harrison would know more about gas than you would. Okay.
But because it appeared at first that he may have been referring to the element, she proceeded to apologize to the entire periodic table, including helium, beryllium, polonium, all of the stars on the periodic table. And I guess that was appreciated, but it was a little bit bizarre. But also hilarious.
It's such a weird place we work, because things go off sideways in 15 different directions at all times. Are they doing that as we leave here? Are we going sideways in relation to where we might be going with vaccines? There seems to be some good news in getting vaccines next week, but the problem appears to be, Lynn, that they're not coming fast enough, and maybe not coming fast enough to those who are most in need right now, because younger people are being affected. As we close out, what are we looking for next week related to vaccine numbers and how that might affect the whole COVID file?
Yeah, so we're expecting quite an increase in vaccine shipments into the province, which are good. This week they were expecting over 18,000 Moderna, over 30,000 Pfizer again, and next week they're expecting Pfizer shipments to double on the weekly, so over 60,000 of those every week. So yeah, things are really ramping up, and I think that's a good thing. But still, starting Friday, people 40 and up are eligible, and that's also when a bunch of priority groups come into play. So we've got the rest of our teachers and firefighters and police and those kinds of groups. But still, we've got a lot of workers who are younger than 40 and not part of those priority groups who are still really concerned about their own safety, obviously. And yeah, if those are the people ending up in hospital, then I don't know how well vaccines are going to help them in the next couple of weeks here until we get way more of those and those age groups keep dropping. But we're also seeing some concerns about variants, obviously, too. And so far, the data seems to show that vaccines are effective against the variants we have, although there's still some debate about the P1 that might be a little less perturbed by our vaccine. But yeah, there's also experts warning that we still need to slow the spread as much as we can now, because if we don't, we could end up with other variants mutating out of this that don't react to vaccines the way that we want them to. And then you'd have to go back and change your vaccine and start this process pretty much all over again. So yeah, this idea of vaccines are the way through this is true to some degree, but we also need to still keep case numbers arguably lower than we have been.
You're a depressing person, Lynn. That would be
so full of good news.
So full of good news. And that's the problem. But on a serious note, hopefully the vaccines will outpace that. I think everybody sort of agrees that yes, vaccines are the way out, but there's sort of a problem at hand. Next week, I guess we'll be looking at more problems at hand at the Saskatchewan legislature. I thank you, Lynn Giesbrecht, for joining us. Arthur White-Crummey, thank you as usual, and we'll see you at the Ledge.
Thanks, Murray.
See ya.